A racist cop tried to corner Big Shaq with flashing lights and false power until the tables turned. One line shattered the illusion. Call the police chief. What began as intimidation became exposure, on camera, in real time. Because when Big Shaq stands his ground, the system doesn't just get challenged, it gets shocked. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun hung over the town of Bellbrook like a secret, warm and generous, but always watching. It wasn't a big place, not on the map, and not in the news. One of those towns where folks claim to know everybody, but truthfully, they just knew who to avoid. Bellbrook smiled with picket fences and church bells, school parades and small-town pride, but under that neatly mowed surface was soil that still remembered pain. Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq as they all called him, had made this town home, not because it was perfect, but because he believed in showing up where you were needed. His mansion sat at the edge of town, yes, but he rarely spent time behind gates. Instead, you'd find him where the people were, at the youth center off Maple, painting murals with teens who didn't think anyone really listened to them. In the grocery store on 5th, carrying Mrs. Geraldine's bags, because she swore her knees had declared war against her. On the cracked courts in the West End, laughing with a dozen kids too young to remember his playing days, but wide-eyed enough to know they were in the presence of someone real. Big Shaq didn't preach. He showed. He didn't talk about being humble. He just was. Despite the bank account, the rings, the fame, he wore his life like a pair of well-worn sneakers, comfortable, open, broken in with experience. At home, his world was anchored by 3 women. His daughter, Medora, quick-footed, sharp-tongued, and smarter than most grown men Shaq had ever known. She was 15 going on 35, with eyes that scanned the world for truth, and a voice that refused to soften for comfort. His mother, Lucille, was the backbone, stronger than steel but wrapped in gospel warmth. She believed in grace, but not at the expense of dignity. Then there was Shawnee, his ex-wife. Their love had changed form, but never faded. They were no longer married, but still tethered in the quiet, unspoken way 2 people are when they've built something bigger than themselves. Theirs was a co-parenting bond that worked not because it was easy, but because it was rooted in respect. Shaq's days followed a rhythm. Morning runs through the South Loop. Breakfast with Lucille, who never stopped reminding him to eat something green. Then it was off to the youth center, his pride and joy. The place was once an abandoned post office, a husk of bricks and broken windows. Now it was alive. Murals covered the walls. There was a music room, a podcast corner, a tiny recording studio funded from Shaq's own pocket. No one knew it, but Shaq often slipped money to the single moms who dropped their kids off there after school. He knew what it was like to need a break. In Bellbrook, Big Shaq wasn't just the celebrity. He was the difference. He'd intervened in fights without throwing a punch, bought a local barber his own shop, helped a high school start a coding program. It wasn't charity, it was presence. He showed up. But in Bellbrook, presence was a complicated thing. Because some people liked Shaq just fine. As long as he stayed in his place, as long as he smiled, donated, played basketball with their sons, and didn't question too loudly. The town liked its change slow and polite. The wounds of its past hadn't been stitched, only covered with fresh paint. There were whispers, always had been, about the lines that shouldn't be crossed. Certain country clubs, certain neighborhoods where even success didn't open doors, only cracked them long enough to remind you they could be closed again. Shaq wasn't naive. He knew fame gave him a shield most didn't have, but he also knew that shield had cracks. And when it cracked, people rarely asked how deep the cut went. One late afternoon, Shaq sat outside the youth center with Myra. She was editing a video on her laptop, earbuds in, focused. He was just watching the street. A police cruiser rolled by slowly. Not unusual. Bellbrook was still small town enough that cops waved when they passed, but this one didn't wave, just slowed, lingered, and then rolled on. Shaq's eyes followed it. Something in the way the tires kissed the pavement too slowly, like they weren't just driving through. They were watching. Was that Branner again? Mira asked, without looking up. She'd noticed too. Shaq didn't answer right away. Could be, he said finally. They said nothing else about it, but it hung there, unspoken. That presence, that watching, that knowing deep in your bones, when something wasn't just coincidence. That night at dinner, Lucille stirred her greens slow and steady like she always did when her thoughts were loud. "You remember when your uncle got pulled over for driving too nice of a car?" she asked. Shaq nodded. He remembered. Some folks don't need a reason to remind you what they think of you. The badge just makes it louder. Shaq didn't argue, didn't question, just listened. Because Lucille didn't talk to make points. She talked to leave warning. Still, Shaq wasn't afraid. He wasn't built that way. He'd stood in arenas with thousands screaming his name. He'd walked streets, in cities that didn't know his face but respected his presence. But something about that cruiser, that slow roll, that silent stare, it didn't scare him. It bothered him. The kind of bother that lingers, that tells you not to look away too fast. In Bellbrook, peace had always been conditional, and Big Shaq, despite all his love for this town, was beginning to sense that the conditions were shifting. The next morning, he arrived at the youth center to find a single piece of paper taped to the door. "Remember your place." No signature. Just thick black letters written in permanent marker. Bold. Deliberate. Shaq pulled it down without a word. Folded it once. Put it in his pocket. He didn't show Manira. Didn't tell Lucille. Not yet. Because Big Shaq believed in one thing above all else. Timing. You don't speak too soon. You don't push too fast. You listen. You wait. And when the time is right, you show up. But what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that the time had already started ticking. And the man behind the cruiser had no intention of just watching. Not anymore. Across the street, tucked just behind a line of parked cars, sat a black and white cruiser with its windows rolled halfway down. The motor idled faintly, low like a purr that wanted to be a growl. Shaq didn't recognize the car right away. He'd seen dozens like it. Small-town cops had nothing better to do than circle the block some days, but this one didn't move. It just sat. But on this particular morning, something felt out of beat. Shaq narrowed his eyes, squinting past the windshield glare. Inside, a lone officer sat with one arm resting out the window, aviator sunglasses fixed forward. His face was unreadable at that distance, but his body language was clear. He wasn't on break. He wasn't writing a report. He was watching. Shaq tilted his head, just slightly. He didn't wave. He didn't nod. Just stood there long enough to be sure. Then, without a word, he turned and went inside. But the next morning, it was back. Same car, same spot, same stare. Only this time, the window was rolled up, the engine off, and the reflection on the windshield made it even harder to see the man behind the glass. Yet Shaq could feel the eyes, even as kids ran across the blacktop, shouting and bouncing balls and dragging backpacks. That cruiser sat still, silent, observing. By noon, the cruiser was gone. No ticketed cars nearby. No incident reports. Just gone, like a vapor in heat. Shaq didn't mention it to anyone. Not that day. At first Shaq thought maybe it was coincidence. Maybe paperwork. Maybe the officer was just killing time before a shift change. But on the third morning, when the cruiser reappeared in the exact same spot, this time with the sunroof open and the radio low enough to hear static, coincidence lost its credibility. Shaq wasn't easily rattled. He'd been watched most of his life by fans, press, security details. But this wasn't curiosity. It wasn't even suspicion. It felt like a threat with a badge stitched to it. The kind that didn't shout or flash lights but just stayed, long enough to remind you it could. At dinner that night, Lucille stirred a pot of gumbo, while Mara scrolled through her phone. Shaq nodded. Slowly. He wasn't watching the center, Ma. He was watching me. Lucille didn't flinch. They always watched us, baby. We just didn't always see him. You seen that patrol car around the center lately? Shaq asked, keeping his tone neutral. Lucille turned from the stove, wiped her hands on a dish towel. Then maybe you're finally seeing what we've always known. Mara looked up. You talking about that cop with the buzz cut? I saw him when I left practice yesterday. He didn't even blink. Shaq exhaled. So it ain't just me. The next week, the cruiser returned. Not daily now, but randomly. A Tuesday afternoon, a Thursday before school let out, a late Saturday when Shaq was repainting the mural wall. It never stayed more than an hour, but always long enough to be noticed. That night, he stood by the window, long after the dishes were washed, and the lights were dimmed. From his upstairs view, he could see down to the youth center's roof. No cruiser, no headlights, just the stillness of a quiet street that had suddenly learned how to feel dangerous. One afternoon, Shaq finally caught a clear look at the officer. The cruiser had parked closer than usual, just across the street, under the broken lamppost. Shaq was fixing a basketball net when the door creaked open, and out stepped Deputy Cole Branner. Early 40s. Fit. That tight, coiled kind of stillness that made it feel like he'd memorized confrontation. He didn't approach, just leaned on the hood, arms crossed, sunglasses on, gaze locked. The next day, the youth center's mail came late. In it, a folded sheet of paper without an envelope. A typed note. No letterhead. Just a single sentence. Hope the kids don't wander too far after dark. Shaq didn't move either. For several minutes, they just stood, divided by a street, but connected by something harder to name. Then Branner gave a nod, half politeness, half warning, and climbed back in. He kept his schedule. Showed up, smiled, played ball, cracked jokes. But something had shifted. He started memorizing license plates. He installed a second security cam over the front door. And he began writing down times and dates, because he'd learned something from the game. You don't call out the foul until you've got the footage. The town noticed too. Or at least parts of it. One of the younger volunteers, a college kid named Emery, asked him one day, "You okay, Mr. Shaq? You been quiet?" Shaq showed it to no one. Shaq smiled, slow, just watching who's watching. That night, he sat with Shawnee in the driveway. She'd come by to drop off some forms for Mara's school, but as usual, the conversation turned to deeper water. "You think it's personal?" she asked. Shaq nodded. "I think it's targeted." Shawnee glanced down the street. "You ever met him?" Branner, "No. But I know his kind." But watching wasn't enough. "What are you gonna do?" "I'm gonna watch right back." Like, did I know who ran things at the center? Who came by? Weird stuff. What kind of questions? The following Monday, Shaq noticed something new. The cruiser had moved one block down. Still in sight of the center, but now at an angle where it could see both exits. That same afternoon, one of the kids, a lanky teen named Trevon, mentioned a cop asking him questions near the gas station. Shaq's chest tightened. Shaq nodded slowly. Didn't panic. But something inside him settled with decision. By Friday, the friend had a name, a background, and a warning. That night, he called a friend from his days in Miami. Not a cop, not a lawyer, just someone who knew things. Told him about Branner, asked him to dig quietly. Branner used to work in Clayville, got reprimanded for racial profiling but never formally charged. Transferred out quietly. Looks like Bellbrook was his soft landing. Shaq closed his eyes. Of course. Now it wasn't a question of if something would happen. It was when. But Shaq wasn't going to run from it. He'd seen men like Branner before. Officers who didn't need violence to inflict damage. They used presence, pressure, patience, and if you weren't careful they'd make you explode just to justify putting you down. So Shaq stayed calm, collected, but not still, and as the sun rose the next day over Bellbrook, the cruiser returned. He bought new hard drives, started backing up footage, called a few media contacts, not to leak, not yet, just to ask some curious questions. Same stare, same spot. But this time, Shaq didn't just stand at the door. He stood on the sidewalk, hands folded, eyes fixed, and Big Shaq was done playing defense. Because the game had officially started. And when Branner glanced up, Shaq gave the slightest smile. The afternoon had that familiar Bellbrook stillness. The kind that settles over small towns like a warm towel after a shower. Calm, predictable, deceptively peaceful. The kids were pouring out of the youth center, laughter echoing off the pavement as Shaq locked the front door. He gave a quick wave to Miara, who was finishing her podcast edit in the media room. He didn't need to say a word. They had a rhythm. She'd lock up the tech room, check the lights, follow him home in 5. He turned toward his car parked at the curb, keys dangling in one hand, grocery list in the other. Then he saw it. The cruiser. Same black and white. Same slow roll posture. This time, however, it didn't stop across the street. It pulled up behind his SUV, lights flickering briefly, no siren. Shaq paused, glanced around. A few teens still lingered near the sidewalk, some tossing a ball, others scrolling their phones. The moment felt like a held breath. Deputy Cole Branner stepped out. Not rushed, not tense, just businesslike, like this was routine. "Afternoon," he said, his voice even and flat, the edges too polished to be friendly. Shaq offered a nod. Everything all right, officer? Branner tapped the edge of his belt, then looked toward the center. Got a call. Said a phone might have been stolen from the rec building. Description matches someone tall, black male. Said he left the building a few minutes ago. Shaq raised an eyebrow, but kept his tone casual. Well, I guess that narrows it down to about 2/3 of the NBA. Branner didn't laugh. His eyes locked onto Shaq's face, reading, assessing, measuring. Mind if I ask you to step aside for a quick check? Shaq didn't move. He let the silence hang for a moment. You're saying someone called in a theft and described me? Branner gave the faintest shrug. The kind that says I'm just doing my job but means I'm running this show. Protocol. Shaq glanced toward the kids still watching, their chatter slowly dying into whispers. He stepped back, placed his hands on his hips, open palms visible. Go ahead. Branner came forward, not aggressively, not clumsily, with the kind of performative caution that says watch how gentle I am even as it humiliates. He patted down Shaq's arms, torso, and legs, stopping just long enough to make it awkward. Shaq held his breath, not from fear, but from a deeper ache. The kind that comes from knowing you're a symbol until you're not. A hero until someone decides you look like a threat. He remembered Lucille's voice from the kitchen, just days before. Don't let him write your story for you. So he didn't resist. He didn't argue. He didn't flinch. He let it happen. Branner finished, stepped back, and offered a tight nod. Nothing found. Appreciate your cooperation. Shaq looked him dead in the eye. Didn't have a choice, did I? Branner gave a half smile, thin and bloodless. We all got choices, Mr. O'Neal. He turned and walked back to his cruiser. Slowly, almost smugly, the kids across the street were frozen, silent. Even Laura, now at the front door, stared in a kind of stunned stillness. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Her face said it all. Shaq climbed into his car, closed the door, and sat still. He didn't start the engine. He didn't reach for the wheel. He just stared ahead, blinking slow, swallowing the kind of heat that starts in the chest and sinks like stone. On the surface, it had been polite, legal, justified enough to stand up in any small-town court. A call, a description, a procedure. But underneath it all, the truth was as clear as the air before a storm. This wasn't about a phone. This was about putting him in his place. At home, the house felt quieter than usual. Lucille had stepped out for church circle. Myrrah stayed in her room. Shawnee had texted, asking if he wanted to talk. He hadn't answered. Instead, he sat on the back porch, the hum of crickets rising, as daylight dimmed into a pale orange dusk. He didn't cry. He didn't rant. He just... The thing that hurt the most wasn't the public pat-down. It wasn't even the implication. It was how easily the air around it all accepted it. No bystanders screamed. No one questioned. The youth center, the kids, the staff, they just watched. Quietly. Like they'd seen it before. Because they had. Shaq wasn't new to this. He'd spent years playing in cities where people smiled at him on the court and stared at him like a suspect at gas stations. He'd worn suits that couldn't soften his skin color. Heard compliments that curdled into suspicion when he wasn't grinning. He thought maybe money had softened it. Maybe fame had bought a little buffer. But today all of that had been peeled back. Today he was just a black man. Tall. Visible. Presumed guilty until politely proven otherwise. Lucille returned just after sunset, humming a hymn under her breath. She took one look at his face and knew. Didn't ask questions. Just sat beside him on the porch and handed him a sweet tea. I remember your daddy once got stopped just for whistling while walking home, she said after a while. Said he looked too happy to be a working man. Shaq chuckled under his breath. Dry. Too happy. That's a new one. Lucille smiled faintly. Ain't about happiness. It's about control. They don't like when we look like we belong too much. The porch creaked under their weight, but neither moved. The silence was heavy, but not empty. After a long pause, Shaq finally spoke. He did it right in front of the kids. Lucille sipped her tea. Then maybe it's time the kids saw the whole truth. Shaq nodded, slowly. A new thought was forming. Not anger, not vengeance, but clarity. The next morning, he arrived at the center early. Earlier than usual. He checked the outdoor cams. Logged into the interior feed. Rewound. Clipped. Archived. He wasn't going to let someone else hold the pen to this story. If Branner wanted to watch, he'd let him. But Shaq would be watching back, with records, with proof, with patience. Because in Bellbrook, smiles could be paper thin, but eyes like Branner's always told the truth. And this time Shaq wasn't letting that truth hide behind a badge. It started like a pattern unnoticed. Small ripples across the still water of daily life. One traffic stop could be written off. 2? Maybe coincidence. But 3 in a week. Then 5 in 10 days. That's when the water started boiling beneath the surface. Silent and deadly. The first stop was on a Tuesday. Shaq had picked up Mimara from school. A quiet ride filled with stories about her science project, and a playlist they both agreed was better than the radio. They were 3 blocks from home when the flashing lights appeared in the rear view. No sirens, just that piercing red-blue pulse that stripped the warmth out of the afternoon. Shaq pulled over calmly. Branner approached with the same rigid stride, tapping the passenger window like they hadn't met before. He said the brake light was flickering strangely. Shaq nodded, handed over his license and registration. Mira sat stiff, hands folded, eyes locked on the dashboard. Branner returned a few minutes later, handed the documents back without a ticket, and added, "Might want to get that checked soon. Safety first." The brake light wasn't flickering. It wasn't even dim. Shaq checked it the moment they got home. It glowed like defiance. The second stop came that Saturday morning. Shaq had decided to run the East Loop Trail. His usual thinking route: crisp air, light fog, earbuds in, steady breath. He didn't notice the cruiser parked along the edge of the park until he circled back. Branner was leaning against the hood, arms crossed. "Morning jog, huh?" he said without moving. "Is there a problem?" Shaq asked, pausing only slightly. "Got a report someone was ducking behind trees. Maybe watching women joggers. Thought I'd check it out. You match the general description." Shaq looked down at his 7-for-1 frame, drenched in sweat, wearing a neon orange vest. "General description?" he echoed. Branner shrugged. "Can't be too careful these days." Shaq didn't respond. Just jogged past, knowing the game now. This wasn't about rules, it was about reminders. The third time it was pizza. Sunday evening, Shaq was headed back from Sal's, carrying 2 pies in the passenger seat. Morat had begged for pepperoni and mushroom. Lucille had requested extra olives. He was 5 minutes from home when the cruiser slipped in behind him, almost ghost-like. This time, Branner didn't bother with small talk, just walked up, flashlight out, peering through the window despite the daylight. "Your plate number pinged as close to one involved in a street racing incident last week. Need to run a quick check." Shaq held back a laugh. "Street racing?" Branner gave that same paper-thin smile. "Just doing my job." 10 minutes later, Shaq was cleared again. No apologies, no acknowledgement, just silence. By now Mira had stopped asking questions when she saw flashing lights. Lucille's posture had changed too, rigid at the dinner table. Her fork pausing mid-air. Anytime Shaq said, "I got stopped today," Shani, never one to stay idle, started recording. License plate logs, dates, times, descriptions. She saved everything in a folder on her desktop titled "Just in Case." "Someone's gotta document this," she told him, voice tight. "You know how fast truth disappears when there's no receipt." Shaq didn't argue, but inside, something heavier than anger started to settle. Not the kind of rage that burns quick and wild. This was something colder, something that wrapped itself around the bones. Every stop made the town feel smaller. Streets once filled with familiarity, now felt surveilled. The grocery store clerk smiled, but her eyes flicked nervously toward Branner's cruiser when it parked outside. Teachers at Miara's school greeted Shaq politely, but their warmth thinned with each passing day. Bellbrook hadn't changed. It had just shown its true face. One night, Shaq sat alone in the center after closing. The mural of the kids they'd painted last summer stared back at him from the far wall. Bright colors, open smiles, unscarred futures. He looked around at the space he'd built, room by room, brick by brick, and wondered how a man could pour everything he had into a place and still be treated like a threat outside its doors. He didn't tell anyone about the letter he found under his windshield the next morning. Typed again, unsigned, "You keep pushing, things gonna snap." He folded it neatly, put it in the same drawer as the others. No reaction, no post online, no press conference, just collected weight. The worst part wasn't the stops themselves. It was the waiting. The not knowing. a slow erosion of breath whenever he stepped into his car or laced up his shoes. It was the haunting realization that even his silence could be read as provocation. He had walked onto the biggest stages in the world and felt less watched than he did now on his own street. Shaq started changing his routes. Not out of fear, but calculation. He wanted to know what Branner was really tracking him, or just the symbol of him. He took longer paths home, switched up his pickup routine and, sure enough, the cruiser followed. Sometimes from blocks away, sometimes parked near alleys like a hunter too proud to admit it was stalking. On a windy Thursday, Branner trailed him for over 6 miles without flashing the lights, just followed. Slow, measured, assertive. Shaq didn't stop, didn't acknowledge him, just drove home, pulled into the driveway and sat there, lights off, engine running, until Branner finally passed.
That night, Lucille placed her hand on his shoulder. "They're trying to wear you down, son."
Shaq met her eyes. They won't. But even he didn't know how much longer he could hold that line. The next day, Mira came home and slammed her backpack on the table. He followed us. Again. At the gas station. Shaq stayed calm. I'm not stupid, Dad. He didn't even hide it this time. Shawnee looked up from her laptop. It's time. Shaq nodded. Slowly. Yeah, he said, voice low. It is. He wasn't talking about confrontation. He was talking about control. Because if Branner wanted a reaction, he'd been denied one long enough. But what he didn't know was that Shaq wasn't just collecting stories anymore. He was building a case, block by block, stop by stop, until silence itself would scream. The truth has a sound, and sometimes it hums quietly through a wire before the world is ready to hear it. Shawnee was the first to move. The tension that had crawled into their routines through street corners, across driveways, and behind windshields had become too persistent to ignore. One night after dinner, without dramatic declarations or heated conversations, she walked out to Shaq's SUV with a small black device in her hand. She popped open the glove compartment, wired the discreet dash cam beneath the dashboard frame, synced it to a hidden cloud account, and shut it all without a word. No theatrics, no announcement, just the subtle, precise move of a woman who'd seen enough to know silence wouldn't save them. Shaq had watched from the porch, not interrupting. He knew what it meant. He didn't argue. It was protection, not paranoia. The next day, she walked into the youth center with another camera tucked in her tote. She installed it in the northeast corner of the main room, high in the ceiling beam near the mural wall. The lens was barely visible, tucked between a speaker and a crossbeam. Motion activated, wide lens, quiet as a whisper. By the time she left, she'd covered the entrances, the parking lot and the back alley with wireless cams that connected straight to a secure server. Mira, who had been watching quietly, stepped in next. She didn't say much, just opened her laptop, wrote a simple tracking script, and linked the camera feeds to her desktop. By evening, she was sifting through timestamps like a surgeon with a scalpel, marking footage, clipping segments, renaming files. Branner Cruiser North, 11 a.m. Branner Kirby Contact Youth Center, 2:42 p.m. Branner follows Shaq exit route, Monday 6:12 p.m. She didn't need to ask for approval. The look in her father's eyes told her everything. This wasn't about overreacting anymore. This was about documenting what the world liked to erase. What they found chilled them, not because it was explosive, but because it was deliberate. Branner was everywhere. Not with sirens, not with guns, but with presence. Always parked just close enough. Always arriving just as Shaq did. Always watching, never speaking, unless he had to. His movements were careful, almost rehearsed, like a man trained in how far he could push a boundary without crossing it. The legal line was never broken, but it was redrawn every single day. In one clip, Branner idled for 23 minutes outside the youth center, his cruiser positioned behind a tree that blocked the view from the road, but gave him a perfect line of sight to the front steps. Another showed him casually following Shaq's car through 4 right turns around downtown, never pulling him over, just staying close, like a shadow without a sun. The more they watched, the heavier it became. Shaq sat at the dining table one night, the soft light from the kitchen haloing his face as he scrolled through footage. His fingers were clenched loosely, a steady rhythm of restraint pulsing through his hand. Every time he paused a clip, it was the same feeling, like witnessing a version of himself being rewritten. This wasn't basketball. This wasn't press conferences and endorsement deals. This was something raw, unfiltered, and painful in a way that didn't bleed, but bruised deep. Shawnee sat across from him, eyes locked on his. You could go public now. These clips alone. Shaq shook his head. Not yet. It's not about me. He wants me to react. Wants me to make it about ego.
Then what's it about?
He exhaled slowly, eyes flicking to the hallway where Mira's light glowed faintly beneath the door. It's about her. It's about the kids in that center. If he feels this bold with me, what happens when it's one of them next? That silence, shared and sharp, hung between them like a wire ready to snap. Lucille, who had stayed mostly quiet through the night, finally spoke from her corner chair, her knitting laid aside. You build the record. You don't just fight back. You prove why you had to. Shaq nodded. Exactly. So he got to work. Every night, after locking the center and walking Mira to her room, he returned to the footage. He organized it by date, by location, by context. He annotated it. His notes short, but clear. No call logged, no traffic violation, no report filed. He added maps, timestamps and angles. Each clip became a brick. Each note, a layer of mortar. He wasn't building a case. He was building a wall that couldn't be ignored. But as the footage mounted, so did the weight. In one video, Branner appeared to whisper something to a passing kid. The boy looked back, confused, then hurried off. Shaq never found out what was said. In another, Branner stood by the school fence, not saying a word, just staring for 12 straight minutes before driving off. Mira, while tough, started locking her windows at night. She began texting timestamps to Shaq. Alerts. Cruiser parked behind church lot again. Passed us twice today. The girl who once cracked jokes now tracked patterns like a war tactician. Shawnee's files grew too. She added backup drives, encrypted folders. She started reaching out quietly to a journalist she trusted in Atlanta. No story. Not yet. Just interest. A feeling. A brewing storm. And Shaq, he kept it all close. Not for fear, but for clarity. He knew the moment he went public, everything would change. Not just for him, but for the town. People would be forced to pick sides. The mask Bellbrook wore would crack wide open. Some would say he was exaggerating. Others would say it wasn't racism. It was procedure. There would be backlash, commentary, maybe even retaliation. But Shaq had reached the place where the fear of that no longer outweighed the fear of silence. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want Branner fired out of spite. He wanted truth. And the truth was, this wasn't just about him. It was about the next kid, the one without a camera, without a platform, without a voice people cared to hear. So, when he finished organizing the last set of files for the week, he sat back in his chair, stretched his arms, and stared at the wall. The mural still smiled at him. Kids in bright colors, arms raised, joy in their eyes. But behind those smiles, Shaq saw something deeper now. Not just hope. Urgency. They were 5 minutes from home. Highway 18. Just past the old Weller's Market, where the road curves around a grove of pines and opens wide into a view of Bellbrook's old water tower. That's when he saw the cruiser again. It wasn't parked this time. It pulled in behind him from the on-ramp like a piece sliding into position on a board that had already been mapped out. Shaq's hands gripped the wheel. Steady. Mira, still scrolling her phone in the passenger seat, didn't notice until she did. Her voice was quiet. Again? He didn't answer. His eyes moved to the rear view. That sinking certainty was back. The one that didn't warn with sirens or speed, but with calculated calm.
The lights flashed.
Shaq pulled over, easing onto the gravel shoulder beneath a wide stretch of sky. He shifted the car into park, took a breath, then reached into the center console, pressed the button on his phone mount. Leave. Streaming. No commentary. No hashtags. Just lens. Mira whispered. Dad. It's okay, he said gently, his voice still even. Just keep your hands visible. The driver's door of the cruiser opened slowly. Not Branner. Another officer. Young. Clean uniform. Tight buzz cut. Shaq hadn't seen him before, but from the other side of the highway, another cruiser pulled up. That one he knew. Branner stepped out. Sunglasses off this time. Eyes locked. 2 cars. 2 officers. 1 target. The young officer approached first, his hand already brushing against the radio clipped to his shoulder. Shaq's window was already rolled down. No sudden moves. License and registration, sir. Shaq passed them without a word. Branner stayed back, watching, measuring. The second officer scanned the license slowly. Then the scanner crackled, loud enough for Shaq and Mira to hear from inside the vehicle. Unit 6, be advised, possible match on suspect from earlier report. Black male, 6'9", possible resistance noted at previous location. Shaq didn't breathe. Mira's voice was a whisper of panic now. What does that mean? Dad, what is that? Branner stepped closer now, hand resting just above the grip of his taser. The weight in his posture had changed. Less calculated now, more eager. Sir, the younger officer said, I need you to step out of the vehicle. Shaq didn't move. He didn't blink. The stream was still rolling. Viewers were climbing by the second. Comments started appearing on screen. Is that Shaq? Why he getting pulled? What's going on? Mira was frozen, tears welling without full release, like her body didn't want to give Branner the satisfaction of fear. Shaq's voice came low, deliberate. You want to explain what I'm being detained for? Branner's face didn't shift, but his silence spoke. The younger officer hesitated, glancing back at his partner. Then came the phrase, sharp and chilling, cutting through the static of the scanner. Suspect not complying. It wasn't said aloud. It was said for record. Shaq knew what that meant. Every word mattered now. Every inch of body movement would be scrutinized, twisted, repackaged. So he didn't move. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He just said one name. One name that split the air like a crack in the sky. Call Chief Weldon. Branner's face changed. Not drastically, but enough. A blink longer than usual. A faint tightening in the jaw. A pause in breath. Excuse me, the younger officer asked. Shaq didn't repeat it. He didn't need to. Branner stepped forward now, too close to the window. His voice was low. What does Weldon have to do with this? Shaq met his gaze with calm that only comes from a man who's not just ready, but done waiting. He knows who I am. He knows what you've been doing. This feed? It's being backed up in real time. I suggest you make the call. More comments poured into the stream. Faces were joining. Viewers weren't just watching. They were screen recording. Shaq knew this wasn't just a clip anymore. This was evidence. Branner stepped back. There was no dramatic showdown. No shouting. But the air crackled with a tension that made every second feel electric. The kind of moment where one heartbeat too loud could tip everything. The younger officer's hand hovered near his shoulder mic. Branner turned to him. Stand down. The kid hesitated. Branner repeated. Louder now. I said stand down. They both backed away. Myra let out a breath that sounded like she'd been holding it for years. Shaq reached for his phone, ended the stream, saved the clip. No words. No threats. Just documentation. He pulled back onto the highway. No cruisers followed this time. The moment passed, but not like a breeze. It passed like a wave crashing over something built too long to bend. And now it had cracked. That night, he sat in the living room with Lucille and Shawnee. Mara upstairs, finally asleep after hours of silence. Shawnee's laptop screen showed the stream's stats, 2.4 million views. Clips reposted. Journalists calling. Emails flooding in. Shaq leaned back in his chair. They were waiting for it to go wrong, he said. They wanted me to make it go wrong. But you didn't, Lucille said. You didn't let him write it. Shawnee looked him in the eye. What now? Shaq didn't smile. Didn't flinch. Now we let the truth speak. They were 5 minutes from home. Highway 18. Just past the old Weller's Market, where the road curves around a grove of pines and opens wide into a view of Bellbrook's old water tower. That's when he saw the cruiser again. It wasn't parked this time. It pulled in behind him from the on-ramp like a piece sliding into position on a board that had already been mapped out. Shaq's hands gripped the wheel. Steady. Mira, still scrolling her phone in the passenger seat, didn't notice until she did. Her voice was quiet. Again? He didn't answer. His eyes moved to the rear view. That sinking certainty was back. The one that didn't warn with sirens or speed, but with calculated calm. The lights flashed. Shaq pulled over, easing onto the gravel shoulder beneath a wide stretch of sky. He shifted the car into park, took a breath, then reached into the center console, pressed the button on his phone mount. Leave. Streaming. No commentary. No hashtags. Just lens. Mira whispered. Dad. It's okay, he said gently, his voice still even. Just keep your hands visible. The driver's door of the cruiser opened slowly. Not Branner. Another officer. Young. Clean uniform. Tight buzz cut. Shaq hadn't seen him before, But from the other side of the highway, another cruiser pulled up. That one he knew. Branner stepped out, sunglasses off this time, eyes locked. 2 cars, 2 officers, 1 target. The young officer approached first, his hand already brushing against the radio clipped to his shoulder. Shaq's window was already rolled down. No sudden moves. "License and registration, sir." Shaq passed them without a word. Branner stayed back, watching, measuring. The second officer scanned the license slowly. Then the scanner crackled, loud enough for Shaq and Mira to hear from inside the vehicle. "Unit 6 be advised, possible match on suspect from earlier report. Black male, 6'9", possible resistance noted at previous location." Shaq didn't breathe. Mira's voice was a whisper of panic now. "What does that mean? Dad, what is that?" Branner stepped closer now, hand resting just above the grip of his taser. The weight in his posture had changed. Less calculated now, more eager. "Sir," the younger officer said, "I need you to step out of the vehicle." Shaq didn't move. He didn't blink. The stream was still rolling. Viewers were climbing by the second. Comments started appearing on screen. "Is that Shaq? Why he getting pulled? What's going on?" Mira was frozen, tears welling without full release, like her body didn't want to give Branner the satisfaction of fear. Shaq's voice came low, deliberate. "You want to explain what I'm being detained for?" Branner's face didn't shift, but his silence spoke. The younger officer hesitated, glancing back at his partner. Then came the phrase, sharp and chilling, cutting through the static of the scanner. "Suspect not complying." It wasn't said aloud. It was said for record. Shaq knew what that meant. Every word mattered now. Every inch of body movement would be scrutinized, twisted, repackaged. So he didn't move. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He just said one name. One name that split the air like a crack in the sky. "Call Chief Weldon." Branner's face changed. Not drastically, but enough. A blink longer than usual. A faint tightening in the jaw. A pause in breath. "Excuse me?" the younger officer asked. Shaq didn't repeat it. He didn't need to. Branner stepped forward now, too close to the window. His voice was low. "What does Weldon have to do with this?" Shaq met his gaze with calm that only comes from a man who's not just ready, but done waiting. "He knows who I am. He knows what you've been doing. This feed? It's being backed up in real time. I suggest you make the call." More comments poured into the stream. Faces were joining. Viewers weren't just watching. They were screen recording. Shaq knew this wasn't just a clip anymore. This was evidence. Branner stepped back. There was no dramatic showdown. No shouting. But the air crackled with a tension that made every second feel electric. The kind of moment where one heartbeat too loud could tip everything. The younger officer's hand hovered near his shoulder mic. Branner turned to him. "Stand down." The kid hesitated. Branner repeated. Louder now. "I said stand down." They both backed away. Myra let out a breath that sounded like she'd been holding it for years. Shaq reached for his phone, ended the stream, saved the clip. No words. No threats. Just documentation. He pulled back onto the highway. No cruisers followed this time. The moment passed, but not like a breeze. It passed like a wave crashing over something built too long to bend. And now it had cracked. That night, he sat in the living room with Lucille and Shawnee. Mara upstairs, finally asleep after hours of silence. Shawnee's laptop screen showed the stream's stats, 2.4 million views. Clips reposted. Journalists calling. Emails flooding in. Shaq leaned back in his chair. "They were waiting for it to go wrong," he said. "They wanted me to make it go wrong." "But you didn't," Lucille said. "You didn't let him write it." Shawnee looked him in the eye. "What now?" Shaq didn't smile. Didn't flinch. "Now we let the truth speak." It was late morning when Chief Weldon returned to the youth center. Not in uniform. Not with a detail. Just a plain button-down shirt and the eyes of a man who'd seen too much and ignored too long. The building was empty, save for the quiet hum of equipment and the faint echo of sneakers in the gym. Shaq had cleared the space for privacy. No kids today, no volunteers, just truth waiting in frames and files. They sat in the media room. Shaq, Ma-Ura, Shawnee, and Weldon. The curtains were drawn. A monitor glowed on the wall. On the desk beside it sat an external drive, the plastic casing worn slightly from weeks of handling. Shaq didn't say much as he loaded the footage. He didn't need to. The silence itself had weight. The first clip opened, with Branner's cruiser parked outside the youth center. Engine off, but the camera caught him gripping the wheel for a full 10 minutes, unmoving, his eyes locked on the entrance like a soldier scoping a target. The second showed him tailing Shaq's SUV through 3 turns without a signal, never initiating a stop, just hovering, waiting. Then came the diner footage. One of Shawnee's contacts had provided it. Security cam, slightly grainy, but clear enough to show Branner seated in a booth with 2 men known for stirring hate under the cover of local heritage pride. He wasn't eating. He was whispering, gesturing toward a laptop open in front of them. One of the men tapped something into a phone, laughed, then glanced out the window. Shaq paused the video. This was 2 days before the second stop. Right after we added the mural of the kids on the east wall. Weldon rubbed his hand down his face. Slowly. You sure about these 2? He asked, pointing. Shawnee clicked on a second window, opened up printed incident reports. Public records that never made headlines. Both filed complaints with the town council about the youth center's funding. Claimed it catered too much to one side of town. One of them's got a history with racial intimidation. Never convicted. Mirera, sitting off to the side, pressed play on another file. This one was audio only, clipped from Shaq's dashcam. Branner's voice was low, off to the side, but crystal clear. It don't matter how tall he stands. They all fall the same. Weldon's jaw tightened. The line wasn't screamed. It wasn't a slip. It was intentional. Chosen. Delivered with the confidence of a man who believed no one would ever hear it. The final clip showed Branner talking to a young black teen outside a convenience store. The boy was wearing a youth center hoodie. Branner leaned in, said something barely audible, but the body language told everything. The boy flinched, looked away, pulled his hood tighter. When the audio cleaned up, the phrase became clearer. They can't protect you forever. Shaq stopped the playback. He's not just watching anymore. He's laying groundwork. Fear, intimidation. He thinks if he shakes me, the center goes down with me. Weldon sat back, the weight of it all, pressing into his chest. This wasn't just about an officer abusing authority. This was about a man intentionally trying to unmake a place built on trust, visibility and growth. A quiet dismantling of progress under the cover of procedure. He cleared his throat. I'm going to act. Internal Affairs gets everything. He's off active duty as of tonight. I'll issue a statement by morning. Shawnee raised an eyebrow. And the footage? Weldon hesitated. That's where it gets harder. Shaq leaned in. Harder for who? Weldon didn't flinch. You put this out. The fire won't just touch Branner. The council will turn. Your name will be dragged. Some of those parents, the ones who've always smiled tight at you, they'll flip. You'll get headlines. Yes, but you'll also get threats. Your sponsors, endorsements, maybe even safety. They'll come for your name, your family, your legacy. Shaq didn't look away. You think I care about a contract right now? No, Weldon replied. But I think you care about your daughter walking into school next week, without people whispering. Mira didn't move. Her voice was calm. They already whisper. Shaq glanced at her. There was pride in his eyes, but also something deeper. Resolve. I've played every game they put in front of me, he said quietly. Followed the rules. Spoke calm. Gave back. Stayed visible. And still, this man's been trying to erase me one stop at a time. So, no, Chief. I'm not worried about whispers. Weldon's gaze fell. This isn't about revenge, Shaq continued. It never was. This isn't about burning things down. This is about making sure the next kid doesn't grow up thinking silence is the price of safety. The room fell still. Weldon finally nodded. Then let him see all of you. Shawnee leaned forward. We release it on our terms. Full context. Full timeline. With your statement lined up behind it. And not just the bad. Miara added, we show the center, the kids, the work, so they can't say this was just about you being pulled over. Shaq nodded. We let the world see the whole picture, not the version they'll try to edit. Weldon stood, slower now. His age felt heavier than usual, but his steps were deliberate. You've got my full backing, he said, and the department's at least for now. I'll say it clear, I'll say it plain. What Branner did wasn't just bad judgment. It was targeted, and it stops here. Shaq reached for the external drive, handed it to him. Truth's on that. Let's see what they do with it. As Weldon left the room, the sun had started creeping through the drawn curtains, soft lines of gold and shadow stretching across the floor. Outside, Bellbrook still looked the same. Quiet roads, flags on porches, kids riding bikes in twos. But inside that building, the air had shifted. This wasn't a scandal. This wasn't a headline. This was a reckoning, slow, steady, and undeniable. By the time the video was posted, it had already been shared in group chats, text threads, and DMs across Bellbrook, and far beyond. No clickbait headline, no dramatic soundbed, just the truth, clean and direct. The footage was cut with care, Shawnee and Mara's fingerprints all over it, timestamps lined up, footage layered, context clear. There was no need for narration. The story told itself. Branner watching from the curb. Branner whispering in booths. Branner following Shaq through neighborhoods, where patrols were never needed. The line that shook viewers into pause. They all fall the same. The uploads hit just after 9 a.m. Monday morning. Within an hour, it had been retweeted by local journalists. By noon, national platforms picked it up. By evening, it led the cycle on every major network not distracted by scandal or sports. This wasn't a celebrity outburst or a viral moment. It was quieter, harder, realer. Shaquille O'Neal. Pulled over. Profiled. Calm. Documented. Exposed. Chief Weldon held his press conference under a gray sky, the courthouse flag stiff against a restless wind. He didn't stand behind a podium. He stood on the front steps, no notes in hand. He named Branner, called the conduct predatory in nature, admitted departmental failure, promised a full investigation, not just of Branner, but of the systems that let him move unchallenged. The statement landed like a stone dropped in still water. Ripples reached every corner of the town. Branner was suspended indefinitely by sundown. His personnel file was sealed. Temporarily, they said. But the court of public opinion didn't wait. Some defended him, calling the footage misleading, out of context. But even they couldn't explain away the diner footage. The whispering, the quiet surveillance. The phrase that echoed too loud to ignore. But what held the line against the backlash? What truly shaped the storm wasn't Shaq's name. It was his record. Not the NBA kind. The real one. A clip of him lifting a fallen tree after a tornado swept through town, long before news crews arrived. Footage from the youth center's opening, where he handed keys to single mothers with tears in their eyes. A quiet video of him kneeling beside a bullied boy in the school hallway, arm around his shoulders. No cameras in sight. One by one, these stories surfaced. Not leaked by PR firms or agents, but by people. Parents, teens, teachers. People who'd seen the work, not the press releases. Stories flooded timeline. Shaq paid my cousin's funeral when no one else could. He used to leave gas cards in envelopes at the corner store. My brother was failing out of school, until Shaq got him a tutor, paid for it himself. The town cracked, not in outrage, but in recognition. It hadn't seen itself clearly in a long time. Now it was forced to. At the local diner, patrons who once smiled politely, now paused mid-sip, unsure if their silence had made them complicit. Some looked away, others offered words, quiet apologies, unsure of their own weight. The barber shop down on Jefferson changed the sign out front. Not all heroes shout. Still, not everyone rallied. There were protests outside the city hall, small but vocal, arguing that law enforcement was under attack. Handwritten signs, thinly veiled accusations. A few familiar faces. One teacher. A small business owner. People Shaq had waved to for years. That part stung more than he wanted to admit. But Mira reminded him, gently. They were never waving at you, just around you. Shaq kept his schedule. No press tours. No exclusive interviews. He showed up at the youth center like always. Handed out backpacks. Checked on test scores. Played 2-on-2 with the kids. After school. Cameras lingered outside the fence. But he never let them inside. That space was sacred. Reporters asked why he hadn't spoken yet. He just said, "I've been speaking. Y'all just started listening." At night he watched the town change. Slowly. Cautiously. The church where he donated Christmas toys without ever signing the tags posted a statement supporting him. The high school's history department added a new elective focused on systemic inequality, taught by a woman who once flinched when Shaq offered to sponsor her field trip. Even Weldon stopped by the center one afternoon. No formal visit, just an old man walking the halls, eyes heavy with the weight of a badge that no longer felt as clean. He found Shaq in the gym, watching Mira run drills with the younger girls. Weldon stood beside him for a long moment before speaking. "You never raised your voice." "No need," Shaq said, still watching the court. Weldon nodded. Never threw a punch. Shaq tilted his head. Didn't need to. Weldon looked out across the court. And somehow you still knocked the wind out of this whole place. Shaq didn't smile. It wasn't about hitting. It was about showing them what they didn't want to see. That night, Bellbrook felt different. Not redeemed, not transformed, but away. The city had watched, and this time, it couldn't look away. Branner was gone. His name removed from the department's staff list with no fanfare, no official goodbye, no send-off. The file marked resigned pending investigation, a phrase that said everything and nothing. There were those who still whispered his name, who said the town had caved to pressure, that it had lost a good man. But the streets didn't miss him. Not really. You don't miss a shadow when you start letting light back in. The youth center had grown, not just in numbers but in shape. Donations flooded in after the footage went public, not from corporations trying to buy redemption, but from regular folks, teachers, old teammates, strangers across the country who saw what Shaq had built and wanted to help keep it standing. The music room doubled in size. The library had real shelves now. The mural wall extended to wrap the whole building, faces painted by kids, stories stitched into the brick. It was no longer just a center. It was a heartbeat. Shaq kept showing up. Every morning, every afternoon. Still no security, no speech-making, just presence. He planted trees outside the new Rick Hall with Mawura, helped rebuild the roof on the old storage shed, and organized a father-daughter field day that drew more families than anyone expected. No one asked him to. No one had to. He did it because the work hadn't ended. It had only changed shape. In April, he flew to D.C. to speak at a congressional hearing on racially biased policing. Not because he wanted to, because Weldon asked him to. Because Mamera told him, "You're not just doing this for Bellbrook now." He sat in a dark suit before a panel of faces that looked interested and exhausted all at once. He didn't read from a script. He didn't bring charts or graphs. He just "I didn't film those stops to go viral," he said. "I filmed them because they kept happening. Because I knew it wasn't just me. I've got a name people know, money, a platform, and still, I was being stalked, profiled, warned." He paused, looked up, made them look back. Now imagine it happening to a kid without any of that. The room didn't applaud. It wasn't built for that. But it listened. And for once, listening felt like enough. When he came home, Bellbrook welcomed him with that same quiet grace. There was no parade, no banner, just the soft honk of a neighbor's car, a bag of fresh produce left on the porch, and a chalk drawing outside the youth center. "Welcome back, coach." Weeks passed, then months. One afternoon, just before summer took hold, Shaq found himself sitting on a bench outside the youth center. The sun dipped low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the cracked blacktop. Kids were playing a fast, sloppy game of basketball. Too many double dribbles. Too many missed layups. Too much laughter to care. Mara sat beside him, sipping on a bottle of lemonade, her long legs stretched out in front of her. "You thinking again?" she asked. "Always," he said. They watched a boy trip over his own shoelaces, fall hard, then jump back up with a smile too wide for the moment. "That kid," Shaq nodded toward him. "He used to flinch every time a car rolled by the court. Now he just plays." Mira looked over at her father. "Because he knows someone's watching with him now." Not at him. Shaq exhaled. A soft sound, but deep. "I don't want statues," he said. "Or speeches. Don't need a building named after me. If we did this right, I want a place where that kid over there doesn't get watched like a threat before he's seen like a human." Mira smiled. Small but proud. "You already made that place, Dad." He shook his head. "No, we did. All of us. Everyone who stayed. Everyone who spoke. Everyone who didn't turn their face away when it got uncomfortable." She leaned her head on his shoulder. A ball bounced out of bounds. A group of kids shouted, chasing it down the hill. Shaq looked out over Bellbrook. Same houses, same streets, but something different in the way they felt. Not perfect, not fixed, but awake. The town hadn't become something new. It had remembered what it could be. Weldon still dropped by the center sometimes. Never in uniform. Just a man trying to find better ways to show up. He spoke less now, listened more. He admitted it once. In a moment no one recorded. "You never swung, Shaq. But somehow you changed the way this whole town breathes." The youth center didn't close that summer. It stayed open late. Lights on. Doors unlocked. Volunteers doubled. Programs expanded. A mural of Branner wasn't painted over. It was redone, transformed into a wall of silhouettes. Not villains, just shadows, reminders of what happens when silence goes unchecked. Shaq never erased what happened. He built on top of it, because that was the real victory. Not trending hashtags, not headlines, but peace. The kind that doesn't come when you win. The kind that comes when you keep showing up, even after the story stops being told. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it stop here. Look closer at your own town, your own silence, your own power. Because injustice doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just parks quietly across the street. Stand up, show up, and when the time comes, be the one who writes the ending.